$412. That's what was left of my retirement check after rent, and it was only the 9th of the month. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. I sat at my kitchen table in Springfield, Missouri with a calculator and a stack of bills, and I did the math 3 times because I didn't want to believe it the first 2. By the end of this, you'll understand why a stranger in a Walmart parking lot changed my life more than 26 years of Army pay stubs ever did. My name's Walt Doggett. I'm 71 years old. I served 26 years in the United States Army, retired as a Master Sergeant, and for most of my life, I thought that meant something. It still does, I suppose. It just doesn't mean what I thought it would mean when it came to money. $2,890 a month. That's my retirement pay and Social Security combined. My rent alone was $1,650. You don't need a calculator to see where the rest of that went, but I'll tell you anyway, because the details matter. Electric was $210 in the summer, sometimes $260. Prescriptions ran me another $180, even with TRICARE picking up part of it, because 2 of the medications I need for my knees and my blood pressure weren't fully covered. Car insurance, gas, food. By the time I got through the list, I had $400 and change to make it the rest of the month. That's not a story about a man who mismanaged his money. I want to be clear about that up front because I know how this sounds. I paid off my house years ago and then had to sell it during my divorce settlement in 2019. I don't drink. I don't gamble. I drove a 2011 Silverado with 190,000 miles on it because I refused to finance a new truck at my age. This wasn't recklessness catching up to me. This was 26 years of service running headfirst into a country where everything got more expensive and my check didn't. Let me back up though, because the money didn't break all at once. It broke slow, the way a rope frays before it snaps. I retired from the Army in 2009. Catherine and I bought a modest 3-bedroom in Springfield, put the kids through school, and for a long time, things were fine. Not lavish, fine. We had a routine, church on Sundays, dinner with the grandkids once a month. It wasn't the life I dreamed about at 19 years old, signing enlistment papers, but it was a life, and it was ours. Then 2 things happened close together. Catherine and I divorced in 2019 after 31 years of marriage over reasons I still don't fully understand myself. And the settlement split what we had nearly in half. And around that same time, everything else started climbing. Rent on the small 2-bedroom I moved into went from $1,100 to $1,650 in 4 years. My pension didn't move an inch in that same stretch. No COLA adjustment came through that made a real dent, not against numbers like that. I remember sitting with my daughter Renee's old accounting textbook one night, trying to understand cost of living adjustments, trying to figure out if I was reading my own statement wrong. I wasn't. There's a particular kind of shame that comes with being a man who served his country for 26 years and still has to choose some months between filling a prescription and paying the electric bill on time. I never told anyone that. Not Renee, not my son Danny, not the guys I still keep in touch with from my unit. I'd sit in my truck in the Walgreens parking lot with a script for my blood pressure medicine in my hand, doing math on my phone, deciding whether this was the month I'd stretch the old bottle, another 2 weeks. One time, and this is the part I still think about, my card got declined at the grocery store, not because the account was empty, because I'd miscounted by $9 and change, and the automatic payment for my electric bill had gone through that morning before I could get to the store. The cashier, a young woman, maybe 22, waited while I put back a box of cereal and a jar of peanut butter, trying not to make eye contact with the man behind me in line. I've stood in combat zones. I've done things I don't talk about. And that $9 in a checkout line in Springfield, Missouri, is one of the things that stayed with me the longest. It wasn't a single humiliation either. It was a slow accumulation of them. I stopped going to breakfast with the other retired NCOs on Thursday mornings, the ones I'd been meeting with for 6 years, because a $5 coffee and an $8 plate of eggs had quietly become a math problem I didn't want to solve in front of men who'd known me since I was 22 years old. I told them I'd developed a sensitivity to eggs. That was the lie I landed on. Nobody questioned it, and I hated myself a little every Thursday morning for not just telling the truth. I started keeping a running list on a legal pad by the door. Not a budget, exactly. More like a scoreboard of what I owed and what was coming in and on what day. I'd cross things off with a pen, and some weeks the pad had more red circles than crossed out lines. My daughter Renee stopped by once when I'd left it out on the counter, and I remember scooping it up fast, the way you'd hide something you were ashamed of before she could get a good look. She asked what it was. I told her it was nothing, just some notes for a project. She didn't push. I think some part of her already suspected, and some part of her didn't want to know yet either. The worst of it came in February, about 8 months before the Walmart parking lot conversation. My truck needed a water pump, an $850 repair I hadn't budgeted for. And the same week, my dentist told me a molar needed a root canal that TRICARE would only partially cover, leaving me with a balance north of $400. I remember sitting in my truck outside the dentist's office, the same truck that needed the water pump, doing the math on my phone calculator and getting a negative number no matter how I arranged it. I ended up putting the dental work off for 3 months, living with a low, constant ache in my jaw that I told myself was manageable. The way you tell yourself a lot of things are manageable when the alternative is admitting you can't afford your own mouth. I started selling things around the house that spring, quietly on a local marketplace app, telling myself it was decluttering, a set of hand tools that had been my father's, a guitar I hadn't played in a decade, a collection of military coins I'd traded and earned over 26 years, sold in a lump to a collector for less than they were probably worth because I needed the cash by Friday, not by the time a better offer might come along. Each sale bought me maybe 2-3 weeks of breathing room before the math caught back up to me. I never told my kids about any of it. I told myself I was simplifying my life. Some nights I even half believed it. I didn't know it yet, but the conversation that would change everything was still about 6 weeks away, and it happened in a Walmart parking lot of all places. I was loading groceries into my truck, the cheap stuff, generic brands, the kind of shopping trip where you put things back before you get to the register instead of after, when a man a few spaces down called out to me he'd seen my Army veteran plate. Older guy, maybe late 60s, tan in a way that doesn't come from a Missouri summer. His name was Gordon Air Force, 22 years, retired staff sergeant. We got to talking the way vets do in parking lots, comparing units and years, and somewhere in there he mentioned he only lived in the States 4 months a year now. Where's the rest of the time? I asked him, mostly making conversation. Lake Chapala, Mexico, he said. My retirement check goes about 3 times as far there as it does here. I pay $400 a month for a 2-bedroom with a view of the water. Full checkup at my doctor down there ran me $18 last month. I laughed the way you laugh at something that sounds made up. Told myself I was just curious. I didn't know that conversation would end with me on a plane 4 months later. That night, I went home and I couldn't stop thinking about it. $18 for a checkup. I'd paid more than that for a copay at the VA clinic parking garage. I started researching quietly, not telling a soul, cost of living calculators first. Then veteran expat forums. There are more of these than you'd think. Guys who served and then found out their retirement pay stretches further outside the fence line of this country than inside it. I read threads comparing what a military pension is actually worth in purchasing power in different countries. I looked into the Mexican temporary resident visa, which at the time required proof of a fixed monthly income of around $1,620. I cleared that with my retirement pay alone. No Social Security needed. A one-bedroom in a town called Ajijic on the shore of Lake Chapala was renting for around $450 a month, fully furnished. A full medical checkup, the kind that would have run me $200 out of pocket back home, even with TRICARE, was $18 to $25. I didn't sleep much those 2 weeks. I'd lie awake doing math I actually wanted to do for once. I booked a 2-week scouting trip in March, told my kids I was taking a vacation, which wasn't exactly a lie, just not the whole truth. I flew into Guadalajara and took a shuttle van the 45 minutes down to Lake Chapala. I remember stepping off that van into air that didn't feel like it was trying to kill you, the way Missouri humidity does in August, and something in my shoulders came down an inch that had been up there for years. I checked into a small guest house for $60 a night. Steep for the area, I'd learn later, but I didn't know that yet. The owner, a woman named Alejandra, handed me a bottle of water and a hand-drawn map of the town with restaurants circled on it. I asked her, half joking, how much a cab ride into town usually cost. She said 40 pesos. I did the math in the taxi 20 minutes later, watching the meter, and it came out to just over $2. $2 for a 15-minute ride that would have run me 12 back home with tip. I spent that first full day just walking, no itinerary, the way you do when you're trying to feel a place out rather than see it. I passed a small pharmacy and stepped inside on impulse just to price check a medication I recognized from my own bottle back home. The pharmacist, a younger man who spoke careful, textbook English, looked it up and quoted me a price that I made him repeat twice. $11 for a 30-day supply of something that cost me $42 with my TRICARE copay back in Missouri. I stood in that pharmacy for a long moment, doing nothing but staring at the number on the little slip of paper he'd written it on, the way you'd stare at a test result you weren't expecting. I ate dinner that first night at a small place on the plaza, grilled fish, rice, a Pacifico beer, and a basket of tortillas. The waitress kept refilling without being asked. The bill came to 180 pesos. I did the conversion sitting right there at the table. $9 and change. For the same meal at a chain restaurant in Springfield, I'd have paid $22 before tip. I met a man named Roberto at that restaurant, the owner's brother, who spoke enough English to ask where I was from and why I'd come. When I told him I was a retired soldier looking at maybe moving here, his whole face changed. He came around the counter and shook my hand with both of his and said something in Spanish that the waitress translated as roughly, "This house is your house now, too." I don't know if he meant the restaurant or the whole town, maybe both. By the fourth day, I wasn't doing tourist math anymore. I was doing living math. I toured 3 apartments with a local rental agent named Carmen. The first was too small, a converted storage room with a hot plate and no real kitchen, going for 5,000 pesos. And I could tell Carmen was watching my face to see if the price alone would sell me on it. The second had a beautiful view, but sat on a busy street with motorcycle traffic until well past 11 at night. And Carmen, to her credit, pointed that out herself before I had to ask. The third one, a 1-bedroom, 2 blocks from the plaza, with a small terrace and a kitchen bigger than the one I had back home, was 8,200 pesos a month, just over $400. I stood on that terrace in the late afternoon light, listening to church bells somewhere down the hill, and for the first time in maybe 3 years, my money and my worries weren't fighting each other in my head. I asked Carmen, almost as an afterthought, what a full medical checkup ran in town, since Gordon's number back in the Walmart parking lot had stuck in my head the whole trip. She made a call right there on the terrace, and 10 minutes later had a name and a price for me, a general practitioner 2 streets over, who charged 350 pesos for a full checkup, blood work included if needed. Just over $19. I wrote the number down on the back of a receipt in my pocket, the same pocket where the $11 prescription slip still was, like I was building a case file for a decision I hadn't officially made yet. I flew home with the decision half made, sitting in seat 14C, somewhere over Texas, still not sure if I'd actually go through with it, not sure how I'd even begin the conversation with Renee and Danny. I spent most of that flight with a notepad on my tray table, writing out the case for myself the way I used to write operations, orders, objective, resources, risks, contingencies, because that was the only language I had for making a decision this large feel like something I had control over instead of something happening to me. By the time we landed in Kansas City for my connection, I had 4 pages filled. And somewhere in the margin of the last page, I'd written, almost without meaning to, the words, "I am not going to spend the rest of my life scared of a grocery receipt." I still have that notepad. It's in the drawer by my bed here in Chapala, and every so often I take it out and read that line again, just to remember what it felt like the moment before I actually believed I could do this. I didn't have to begin it. Renee found the listing agreement in my email when she was helping me set up a new laptop 3 weeks later. She didn't yell. Renee's never been a yeller. She just went very quiet and said, "Dad, what is this?" I told her the truth, that I was thinking about moving to Mexico, that my retirement check wasn't cutting it here anymore, that I'd found a place where it would. She called Danny that same night, and 2 days later, they were both sitting in my living room, the way I imagined they'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over. Danny led with the practical stuff, because that's who Danny is, Dad. If something happens to you down there, a fall, a heart thing, who's paying for a medevac flight back? You think TRICARE is going to just cover that seamlessly in a foreign country? It was a fair question. I told him I'd already looked into international supplemental insurance, that a policy covering medical evacuation was running me $60 a month, less than what I was currently paying out of pocket for 2 prescriptions. Renee's objection came from somewhere else. You're 71, Dad. You don't speak Spanish. What if you're lonely down there? What if something happens and none of us can just drive over? I didn't have as clean an answer for that one. I told her I understood the fear, that I loved her for it, but that I'd been lonely here too, in a house with cable I couldn't afford and a fridge I kept half empty on purpose. The conversation ended without either of them agreeing with me and without me changing my mind. Renee's last words before she left that night were, "I just don't understand why you can't be safe here." I didn't have an answer that would have landed. I let the silence sit there instead of filling it. They came back 2 days later, together this time for what Renee called one more conversation and what felt to me like a second round of the same fight with better preparation. Danny had printed out an article about elder scams targeting American retirees abroad. Renee had a folder, an actual manila folder with printouts about healthcare access for foreign residents in Mexico, most of it outdated by a couple of years, the kind of thing you find on page 4 of a search result. I sat and let them present it all the way you'd sit through a briefing you already knew the conclusion of. When they finished, I asked them a question instead of answering theirs. Can either of you tell me what my retirement check actually covers right now? Not what you assume, what it actually covers. Neither of them could. Danny guessed low. Renee didn't guess at all. I pulled up 3 months of bank statements on my phone and set it on the coffee table between us and just let them look. I watched Renee's face change first, the particular stillness of someone doing math they hadn't expected to have to do. Danny took longer, flipping back through the months, and when he finally looked up, he didn't say anything for a good 10 seconds. Dad, why didn't you tell us it was this bad? I told him the truth, that a man doesn't get to spend 26 years being the one his soldiers depended on and then turn around and ask his own children to carry him. It wasn't the right instinct, maybe. It was the only one I had. That didn't end the argument, but it changed its shape. The rest of the conversation was quieter, less about whether I should go and more about how, and by the time they left that night, Renee hugged me at the door in a way that felt less like a goodbye and more like someone trying to memorize what I felt like just in case. I sold most of my furniture over the next 6 weeks. Kept a few things, my father's old toolbox, photos, the folded flag from my retirement ceremony, and shipped them ahead in 2 boxes. I signed the lease on the apartment above the plaza, sight unseen, for a second time, trusting Carmen's photos. I said goodbye to my neighbor Frank, who'd lived next door for 11 years, and just shook my hand and said, "Well, hell, Walt, send me your address. I'll come drink a beer with you." The flight down in June felt different from the scouting trip. Heavier suitcases, a one-way ticket, no plan to be back on any particular date. I landed in Guadalajara at 4 in the afternoon, and by the time the shuttle dropped me at the apartment, the sun was going down over the lake in a way that turned the whole sky the color of a ripe peach. Carmen met me with the keys. She'd left a small welcome basket on the counterbread, coffee, a few pieces of fruit, and a note in careful English that said, "Welcome home, Sir Walt." That night, I walked down to the same restaurant from my scouting trip, ordered the same grilled fish, paid the same 180 pesos, and counted the change back into my hand slower than I needed to, just to feel it. The first few weeks weren't easy, and I want to be honest about that, because anybody telling you this kind of move is all sunsets and cheap beer is lying to you. I didn't speak the language beyond please and thank you and how much. I didn't know how to pay my water bill. I got lost twice trying to find the pharmacy. There was an afternoon in the second week where I sat on my terrace watching the sun go down over a lake I still didn't quite believe was mine to look at, and felt a loneliness so specific I couldn't have described it to anyone back home. Not the loneliness of missing people exactly, but the loneliness of not yet belonging anywhere, caught between the life I'd left and the one I hadn't fully built yet. I called Danny one Sunday night and he asked how it was going, and I told him the truth. It's hard. I feel like an idiot half the time asking people to repeat themselves. Yesterday, I stood in the pharmacy for 10 minutes trying to explain I needed a refill and ended up just handing the pharmacist the empty bottle like a caveman. But I paid my electric bill and both my prescriptions this week, and I still had money left over. I haven't done that in 3 years. He didn't say much back, just, "That's good, Dad. That's real good." Some nights that first month, I'd lie awake doing the opposite of what I used to do back home. Instead of subtracting bills from a shrinking number, I'd add up everything I hadn't had to worry about that day. And the list kept getting longer even while the loneliness hadn't fully lifted yet. Both things were true at once, the hard and the good, running side by side, and nobody had told me that's how it would feel. I'd expected relief to replace the fear outright. Instead, they sat together for a while, the way I suppose most real changes do. My next-door neighbor, a widow named Lupita, probably 70 herself, showed up at my door the second week with a plate of enchiladas I hadn't asked for and didn't know I needed. She didn't speak much English. I didn't speak much Spanish. We communicated mostly through gestures and her patient repetition of words until I got them right. She started leaving food on my step, maybe twice a week, and I started leaving cut wood from a fallen tree branch on hers. And somewhere in there, we became something like family, without either of us really deciding to. Down the street was a man named Efren who ran a little hardware stall, and when my ceiling fan died in the July heat, I stood in his shop trying to mime the problem with my hands. He laughed, grabbed a bag of parts, and walked back to my apartment with me. Fixed it in 20 minutes. When I tried to pay him for his time, not just the parts, he waved me off. "Vecinos," he said, Neighbors. That's what that word means, and it did more explaining than I could have done myself. There was a harder week too, somewhere around week 6, that I don't want to skip past. I got the dates wrong on a water bill payment and came home to find the water shut off, standing in my kitchen with a dry faucet and no idea who to call or what the process even was to get it turned back on. I sat down on my kitchen floor for a minute, genuinely rattled, feeling every bit the old man alone in a country he didn't fully understand yet. It was Lupita who noticed my lights on, but no sound of running water when she came by with tamales that evening. And it was Lupita who walked 2 doors down and got a neighbor's grandson, a boy of maybe 16, who spoke decent English, to call the utility company for me. Water was back on within the hour. I sat at my kitchen table after they left and cried for the first time since the divorce, not out of sadness exactly, just the strange, overwhelming relief of being taken care of by people who owed me nothing. By the 3rd month, I had a rhythm. Coffee on the terrace at 7. A walk down to the market for produce that cost half what it did back home and tasted twice as good tomatoes still warm from the sun, avocados I could buy 5 of for what one would cost at the grocery store in Springfield. I started going to a weekly meetup for expats that gathered at a bar near the plaza, mostly Americans and Canadians. A lot of us military retirees comparing notes on visa renewals and doctors and the best place to get a decent steak. I met a man named Hollis, retired Navy, who'd been in Chapala for 9 years. He put it plain the first night I met him. First year's the hardest. You're going to miss things you didn't know you loved. But you stop doing math in your head every single night, and eventually you stop missing the math. Hollis introduced me around like I was already one of them, which meant more than he probably realized. He walked me through things nobody tells you in the visa paperwork: which pharmacy gave the best prices, which doctor to see for what, how the temporary resident visa renewal actually worked in practice versus what the website said. He'd been a chief petty officer, retired on a pension not far off from mine, and he told me over a beer one night that back in Tampa, he'd been skipping meals 2 days a week his last year there just to make his mortgage payment. Nobody believes that about a 22-year Navy man, he said, but there it is. Down here, he said, he ate well every single day and still put money aside. I asked him if he ever regretted it. He just laughed. Only regret is, I didn't do it 5 years sooner. I started volunteering, almost by accident, at a small English tutoring program run out of the community center near the plaza. A retired teacher named Marisol ran it, mostly for kids whose parents worked in the tourist trade and wanted them fluent for better jobs down the line. I wasn't a teacher. I'd never done anything like it, but I showed up on a Tuesday because Hollis dragged me along, and by the 3rd session, a boy of about 9 named Pablo had started saving me a seat and greeting me every week with, "Good morning, Sir Walt," practicing the phrase like it was a gift he was handing me. It became the best 2 hours of my week without me planning for it to. I didn't know my body was about to test everything I just decided to believe. It was late September, about 4 months in, when I woke up one morning with a tightness in my chest that scared me enough to call Hollis instead of trying to sleep it off. He drove me to a private hospital in Guadalajara himself, wouldn't hear otherwise, talking to me the whole drive to keep my mind off the pain, telling me about the time he'd had a similar scare his 2nd year in Chapala, and it had turned out to be nothing more than bad tacos and worse stress. It didn't fully calm me down, but it helped. The intake nurse had me in a room within 15 minutes, an EKG within 25. I lay there watching the machine trace lines across a small screen, doing the same thing I imagine every man my age does in that moment, running a private inventory of every regret and unfinished conversation, thinking about Renee and Danny and whether I'd made the right call, bringing myself this far from them, if this was really it. A cardiologist, a woman who'd trained partly in the States and spoke better English than half the guys I served with, reviewed the results herself. She sat on the edge of the bed, which no doctor had done for me in the States in 20 years, and asked me questions slowly, patiently. How long had I been feeling this? Was I under new stress? Had my diet changed? What did a typical day look like for me now? I found myself telling her about the move, about Springfield, about the parking lot conversation with Gordon, more than I'd told Renee or Danny in one sitting. She listened to all of it before she even mentioned the test results. It wasn't a heart attack. Severe acid reflux, mimicking cardiac symptoms, made worse by stress and too much coffee on an empty stomach, she told me, to eat before caffeine and to come back if anything changed. She wrote out the diagnosis and a prescription by hand in careful block letters and slid it across to me with the kind of unhurried patience that made me feel, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like I was being treated as a person and not a claim number. I sat there for a moment after she finished, waiting for the bill, bracing for it the way you brace for cold water. In the States, an ER visit like that, even one that ended in a relatively benign diagnosis, could easily run past $1,000 once you counted the facility fee, the EKG, the physician charge, before insurance even touched it. I'd seen bills like that from friends. I was already doing the math on how I'd cover it, wondering if this was the emergency that finally broke the whole plan. Total cost, including the EKG, the consultation, and the medication, 950 pesos. I did the math twice before I believed it. Just under $50. Back home, that same visit, the ER intake, the EKG, the cardiology consult, would have run me well past $400, even after TRICARE, and that's if nothing else went wrong. I sat in the waiting room afterward with the receipt in my hand for a long time, not moving, just staring at the number the way I used to stare at bills that went the other direction. I called Renee that night and told her everything, chest pain included, because I didn't want her hearing it secondhand and thinking I was hiding things from her. There was a long pause on the line. "Are you okay?" Her voice was tight, in a way I recognized from when she was a little girl, scared of thunderstorms. "I'm fine." It was reflux. And Renee, the hospital here, it was fast, it was good, and it cost me $50. Another pause. "I still wish you were closer, Dad." "I know, sweetheart. Some days I do too." Danny came to visit first, about 5 months in. He arrived skeptical, the way I expected, with a legal pad of questions he'd clearly prepared on the flight. I took him through the town, showed him the apartment, walked him past the hospital I'd used. He asked to see my bank statements, actually asked, and I showed him without hesitation because I wanted him to see the numbers stop bleeding. He sat at my kitchen table flipping through 3 months of statements, and I watched his shoulders come down slowly, the same way mine had on that first shuttle ride from the airport months earlier. On the second day, we sat at the same restaurant on the plaza, and he watched me pay the bill for both of us, 2 full meals, drinks. And it came to less than what he'd have paid for 1 plate at a chain restaurant back home. I watched him do the math himself, watched something behind his eyes recalculate. We walked past the hardware stall, and Efren waved at me by name, called out something in Spanish that made Danny raise his eyebrows. "He knows you," Danny said, like it surprised him. "Everybody here knows me," I told him, and I don't think I'd ever said a truer sentence about my life in the States. He didn't say much that trip, but on his last night, standing at the door with his bag, he said, "Okay, I get it now. I still worry, but I get it. It wasn't warm. Exactly." It was honest, and from Danny, that was close enough. Renee came 4 months after that, staying longer than Danny had 10 days. She was harder to convince because her worry had never been about money. It was about distance, about being far from me if something happened. I didn't try to argue her out of that fear. I just let her see the life. She met Lupita, who fed her enchiladas the same way she'd fed me, and pulled Renee into a hug like she'd known her for years. Lupita held Renee's face in both hands at one point, the way grandmothers do, and said something in Spanish that Marisol later translated for me as, "Your father is loved here. You don't have to worry so much." Renee cried a little at that, standing in Lupita's kitchen, and didn't try to hide it. She sat with me at the expat meetup and watched Hollis and the others treat me like family, watched a table of near strangers argue good-naturedly over who got to buy the next round of beers in my honor because it was her first visit. On her fourth day, she came with me to Pablo's tutoring session and watched the boy run up and hug my leg before he even said hello to me properly, chattering in a mix of English and Spanish about a spelling test he'd passed. I watched Renee's face while she watched that. It was the same look Danny had worn watching me pay the restaurant bill, the look of someone rebuilding an entire picture from new information. On her last night, sitting on my terrace with the church bells ringing somewhere below us, she said quietly, "I thought you were running away from something." I asked her what she thought now. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, "Now I think maybe you were running towards something. I just wish it didn't have to be so far." I told her I wished that too some nights. Both things can be true. It's been 3 years now. My retirement check is the same amount it's always been. Nothing about my income changed. What changed is what it can buy. I've rebuilt a small savings cushion for the first time since the divorce. Nothing dramatic, just enough that an unexpected bill doesn't send me into that old spiral of counting and recounting. Last spring, when Renee's transmission went out and she was short on the repair, I was the one who wired her the money, not the other way around. And I won't pretend that didn't feel like something settling back into its right place. The legal pad by the door is gone. I threw it out about a year in, once I realized I hadn't opened it in months. I still keep a budget because that's just who I am. But it's a different kind of list now, not a scoreboard of what I owed, just a simple accounting of a life that finally adds up. It isn't perfect. I still get frustrated some days with the bureaucracy of visa paperwork, standing in a government office in Guadalajara for 2 hours over a stamp I could have sworn I already had. I miss real barbecue more than I expected, to the kind you can only get in certain parts of Missouri, and I haven't found anything down here that comes close. There are power outages a couple times a year that kill the internet right in the middle of a call with my grandkids, and something in me still tightens up a little every time, some old instinct that expects the worst. Those things are real, and I won't pretend they're not. But I weigh them against a country where I no longer flinch when a waiter sets down the check, against a body that gets real medical attention for $50 instead of me deciding to wait it out, against neighbors who show up at my door with food I didn't ask for just because that's what people do here, against a boy named Pablo who still saves me a seat every Tuesday and has started in the last few months correcting my Spanish instead of the other way around, laughing every time he does it. Last week, Efren's wife's washing machine broke, and I drove over with the little bit of tool knowledge I picked up over 26 years of fixing Army equipment and got it running again. She tried to pay me. I waved her off the same way Efren once waved me off. "Vecinos," I told her, and she laughed at my accent, and that was that. Hollis retired from the expat meetup circuit last year, not from Chapala, just from the weekly bar gatherings. Said his knees weren't what they used to be for sitting on those stools. I go check on him now the way somebody once checked on me when I first got here. Brought him soup last month when he had the flu, sat with him for 2 hours while he complained about the Cowboys, and left feeling like I'd paid forward something I could never fully repay. That's the part nobody warned you about when they tell you the numbers, the cost of living comparisons, the visa requirements. They don't tell you that eventually you become someone else's Gordon in a parking lot, someone else's Hollis walking them through their first hard year. I didn't expect that. I didn't know at 71 I still had room to become someone new. I'm not the man doing math in a Walmart parking lot anymore. I'm not the man who put back a jar of peanut butter while a line of strangers watched. I'm just Walt, who drinks his coffee too strong on a terrace that costs $400 a month, who still can't roll his R's right no matter how many times Lupita corrects him, and who finally, at 71 years old, gets to spend a retirement check on living instead of surviving. $412 used to be the number that kept me up at night. These days, the number I think about most is 19. What a full checkup costs at the doctor 2 streets over. Some numbers haunt you. Others set you free. I didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table doing math for the 3rd time, that I'd end up on the right side of one of those someday. Before I let you go, I want to mention something that might help if you're sitting where I was sitting 2 years ago. There's a guide I came across after I'd already made most of these mistakes the hard way. It walks through the real cost comparisons, the visa requirements, and the questions you should ask before you commit to a move like this. The kind of unfiltered information I wish somebody had handed me at that kitchen table instead of me learning it one Walmart parking lot conversation at a time. I'm not the one who put it together, and I'm not selling anything. There's a link in the description if it's useful to you. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. There are more stories like mine than you'd think.